We're early. If everybody raises their hand, we could even do 4 songs. 260. What? 99? I heard her. I'm concerned about the number. 99. It doesn't sound familiar. 99. I've driven the old 99, but I don't know that I've sang it. Oh, well, that's a good, okay. I'm used to singing it out of this book. Okay. I've got to get my pencils out, though, because there's 5 verses. Okay. Ready? Is it different? You're on 97. Huh? Well, we don't want it on 97. No. When we walk with the Lord in the light of His Word, what a glory He sheds on our way. While we do His good will, He abides with us still, and with all whom will trust and obey. Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus, but to trust and obey. Not a shadow can rise, not a cloud in the skies, but His smile quickly drives it away. Not a doubt nor a fear, not a sigh nor a tear can abide while we trust and obey. Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus, but to trust and obey. Not a burden we bear, not a sorrow we share, but our toil He richly repay. Not a grief nor a loss, not a frown nor a cross, but is blessed if we trust and obey. Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus, but to trust and obey. But we never can prove the delight of His love till all on the altar we lay. For the favor He shows and the joy He bestows are full all you trust and obey. Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus, but to trust and obey. Then in fellowship sweet we will sit at His feet, or we'll walk by His side in the way. What He says we will do, where He sends we will go. Never fear, only trust and obey. Trust and obey, no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and obey. Next. Wendy. 115. 116 in the red. Are you weary? Are you heavy-hearted? Tell it to Jesus. Tell it to Jesus. Are you grieving over the joys departed? Tell it to Jesus alone. Tell it to Jesus. Tell it to Jesus. He is a friend that's well known. You know such a friend or brother, tell it to Jesus alone. Do the tears flow down your cheeks unbidden? Tell it to Jesus, tell it to Jesus. Are you sin and in the arms of Zion? Tell it to Jesus alone. Tell it to Jesus, tell it to Jesus. He is a friend that's well known. You know other such a friend or brother. Tell it to Jesus alone. Do you fear the gathering clouds of sorrow? Tell it to Jesus, tell it to Jesus. Are you anxious? What shall be tomorrow? Tell it to Jesus alone. Tell it to Jesus, tell it to Jesus. He is a friend that's well known. You know other such a friend or brother. Tell it to Jesus alone. Are you troubled at the thought of dying? Tell it to Jesus, tell it to Jesus. For Christ's coming kingdom are you sighing? Tell it to Jesus alone. Tell it to Jesus, tell it to Jesus. He is a friend that's well known. You know such a friend or brother, tell it to Jesus alone. Crystal? 47 in the blue. 47. 4-7 in the blue. Song of Eli in the city so bright, will be wafting near heaven's fair dome. How the ransom will rise and the song is come. All of God's children come home. When all of God's singers get home, whenever a sorrow will come, there'll be no place like home. sing here on earth, song of sadness or mirth, 'tis a foretaste of rapture to come. But our joy can't compare with the glory up there, when all of God's singers get home. When all of God's singers get home, where never a sorrow will come, there'll be no place like home. When all of God's singers get home, having overcome sin, hallelujah, amen, will be heard in that land of the foam. Every heart will be light, and his face will be bright, when all of God's singers get home. When all of God's singers get home, wherever a sorrow will come, there'll be no place like home. When all of God's singers get home.
All right. Well, good afternoon. It's good to have everyone here. In way of announcements, we have Ladies Bible Study this Wednesday at 10, and then Brother Corey will be leading out in the Church Bible Study at 7 on Wednesday, so keep him in your prayers. And then we have Labor Day Camp coming up September 3rd through the 8th. Okay. The 6th, that Sunday, we will not have afternoon services or lunch, so plan accordingly. But we are inviting everyone out to camp for lunch, which, what do we say, 2 o'clock is what time we typically eat. So 2 o'clock we'll have lunch out at the camp, and then if you'd like to stay, we usually do. We won't be doing any campfires this year, but we'll do some songs and testimony service out at the camp. So, any other announcements? Okay. All right. If there aren't any others, let's open up with a word of prayer. Brother Joe, would you lead us in a word of prayer? Amen. All right, if you'll open your Bibles to Genesis chapter 10. We will see how long this one goes. We are going to talk a little bit about the descendants of Noah. And as we go through this, we're not going to read verse by verse. I will let you guys read them at home. That way I'm going to point out some things as we go through this and kind of give you some brief points as we look at this, but I'm not going to stumble through the names. One of the things that I've heard other pastors do is that when they come to a name that they have a hard time with, they just go Mr. A for their first initial, or Mrs. or whatever. We're not even going to do that. We'll look at a couple of things. There's a few verses that we're going to look at, or I'll point out a couple of things. But as we look at this, the key, Jesus or God has given us these descendants, and part of the reason I believe He's given us the descendants of Noah and of other people is it's just a reminder of where we've come from. And I think that's the key, is understanding. Many times people ask me, why does the Bible have all these different descendants and genealogies and different things like that? And I think it's really just to understand that there is a lineage. God has taught us, and we have seen in God's Word, He's told us how God's Word started at the very beginning with Adam and Eve, and we can take that lineage and continue it down through Noah, through Abraham, which we'll see that a little bit today, and tomorrow, or next Sunday. We go into Matthew, where it talks about Jesus Christ, and we know the importance of that to show that not only is Jesus man, but He is also God, and not just God, but He's also through the lineage of David, and He has the rightful heir to the throne. And so there's a lot of reasoning behind some of these things, and so they are important, and so I don't want to just kind of glance over it and say they're just, names and they don't mean anything. They do mean things, but for what I'm wanting to do, and as we go through this, we're not going to take name by name, where I want to just hit some highlights, because I think they're important as we go into this next chapter. We'll find in Genesis chapter 11, where he is going to talk about the Tower of Babel. Now, a couple of things that I want to point out that I think, one of the things about Genesis is when you read it, I think there are some things to understand. Is not that even with this chapter, after I have read it and I go and I look at Genesis 11, I think that there may be some things that are repeated when we come to Genesis 11. And I'll explain to you a little bit why I think that, and why others may think that also. So you can't take chapter 1 and say then there's chapter 2. Well, you can say that, but there's some of those, like chapter 2, where it kind of talks and describes what Jesus did in chapter 1. You go to chapter 3, then he talks about man, he talks about the fall. Then you see there's a big gap of time in there. Then you have Noah on the scene, and then we have the descendants. And so I think with chapter 10 and 11, I think he's giving us the list of descendants, and then he's going to talk about the Tower of Babel. And what happens at the Tower of Babel? Confusion, okay? Well, he talks about that confusion in chapter 10 also. He talks about different languages and things like that. And so you'll see that. And I think that there's a little bit of overlap when you look at those two things, okay? So just kind of some interesting facts when you look at that. So let's go ahead and get started. And let's start with verse 1. And we will, we'll just jump right off and see where we land. So Genesis 10, verse 1, it says, "Now these are the generations of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and upon them were sons born after the flood." So before we get going too far, what was the very first commandment that God, or the first commandment that God gave Noah and his family? Replenish, okay? Replenish the earth, okay? And take and occupy it, okay? And so he wants them to start over. And I said this a couple weeks ago, and it's true that we are descendants of Noah. Okay, we come from that line, and in fact, I would submit to you that I would say we probably are descendants through the line of Japheth, but I don't have any proof of that. I'll share with you why I think that, because I think the descendants of Shem will be the Jews, because that is where Abraham comes through, and then the descendants of Ham are the Canaanites. Okay, so Japheth, it talks about how they are the Gentiles. Okay, and you'll see that in a couple verses. But let's. So first of all, he's going to talk a little bit. We find he talks about Noah and his descendants, and so then he's going to start. The chapter is divided up into the three sons, and it talks about their descendants. So the first one that he talks about is verses 2 through 5, which talks about Japheth and his family. Now, you go from chapter 2 all the way to chapter 5, you'll find that it said in verse 5, it says, "By these were the isles of the Gentiles divided in their lands, everyone after his tongue, after their families, in their nations." Okay? So some key points when you start looking at this. You're going to see the names, some familiar names, Japheth, Gomer, Magog, and others, and just different other names. But I wanted to look at verse 5 most of all. When you look at verse 5, it talks about how they are the descendants of where his descendants were divided and were considered the Gentiles. And that is where, and he talks about how they were divided in their lands. What you're going to see is it also tells them that everyone after his tongue and after their families and their nations. Now, when did the tongues or change of languages happen? Tower of Babel, okay? So when I read this, what I see is he's talking about the next chapter also, okay? So at some point there was a change in the languages because of the Tower of Babel. We'll talk a little bit more about that next week about the Tower of Babel. So that's why I say you can't just take these verses and say this is what's happened, because I don't think that the separation of languages came till the Tower of Babel, okay? So at some point they all were talking the same language, then later on their languages were blurred. God caused them to be disrupted, and so that is what caused them to divide and go to their different places. Now, we find that Japheth would be the lineage of the Gentiles. He also says, it also talks about that they would divide by tongue and family. So Japheth's family would have stayed together, and they would have migrated towards where God would have had them. There's a lot of speculation as to the cities and different places. There's a lot of speculation as to what it looked like for these guys, what they did. I was reading some commentaries, and everyone's a little bit different, and I'm really not going to get into that part. Some believe that these Gentiles were more of the artists and things like that. I don't know. The Bible doesn't really make that clear for us, but it does tell us that they did separate, and they went their separate directions. And we'll see more as to why that happens in the next chapter, okay? All right, any questions on Japheth? I told you we're going to get through this fairly quick, okay? All right, the next is we have the descendants of Ham, Genesis 10, verses 6 through 20. Now, we already know who the descendants, we know what nationality the descendants of Ham are going to be. Anybody remember? Canaanites, okay? So we look at the last chapter, chapter 9, that Ham was the cursed son, okay? And he talks about how they were going to be the Canaanites. The Canaanites were the ones that were the constant, had a constant issue with the Jews and with God's trial, or God's people. We also see the Canaanites were servants to the Gentiles, or to Japheth and his family. So there was that constant battle and that constant curse with them. Now, as many would say this is more of the lineage of some say of the ungodly, but I don't want to say they can't be saved, because they can, okay? And I think that's important to understand, that yes, they probably were not the chosen lineage, but they still had the opportunity to come to know the Lord as anyone else, okay? And so, but they were the ones that were cursed. So some things to see about them. One of the first things we find is that it is talked about Nimrod. It says in chapter 8, it talks about Nimrod. And Cush begat Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel. Okay? So it talks a little bit about Babel even in chapter 10. Okay? So understand that as Babel was, many times we just look at chapter 11, it's actually being talked about in chapter 10 also. And so it is talked, and I think Nimrod was the ruler, Nimrod was a hunter, and he was part of the kingdom that would start helping to build that Tower of Babel and get that going. It says in verse 10, in the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, and Erech, and those other guys. Out of the land went forth Asher, and builded Nineveh and city Jehobeth and Calah. And he continues to talk about cities that were built out of these descendants. Now, there's cities that we recognize, right? Nineveh, right? That's one we know. Babel is one we know about. And so there are these great cities that they create and they come, but most of them are ungodly, right? And so we find Nineveh is one that is preached to by Jonah, not Noah, Jonah, and Jonah goes to Nineveh and they repent, okay? But then later on we find Nineveh is destroyed because of their corruption, and they're not willing to follow the Lord, okay? The other thing is, I mentioned this is the lineage of the Canaanites. So Canaan would be what these people would be called. You look down at verse 18. It says, and Arvadite and Zemarite and the Hamathite, and afterwards were the families of the Canaanites spread abroad. And the border of the Canaanites was from Sidon, as thou comest to Gerar unto Gaza, as thou goes unto Sodom and Gomorrah, and Adam and Admah, and Zeboam, and even unto Laish. These are the sons of Ham after their families, after their tongues, in their countries, and in their nations. Now, I believe their language was different from the language of Japheth, or not Japheth, of the other brother, Japheth. Or I'm getting all my names mixed up. But his brother, I believe, all three brothers had three different languages, okay? And they were different for each one, and you will see that they migrate or they go into different areas based off of their language and their families. You know, and let's just talk about that for just a minute. Families are important to God, right? And you look from the very beginning of time, you see from the time of Adam and Eve, and you see even into the Jews and through them, how God made it important that families stay together. God felt it was, I believe also that when you look at the scriptures, God makes it important that the families are the ones that teach the children, okay? The parents are to do that. And so as you look at this, I think you see a lot of those cultures and those things happening where God says, you're a family, you stay together, you move together, you go to where you need to be, and as a family. You don't just wander off by yourself. Now, that changes when who comes up on the scene? Abraham. Because what does God tell Abraham to do? Leave your family, right? To go do what? Find a city whose builder and maker is God, okay? So that changes a little bit. But part of that is, I believe, even then, I believe part of Abraham's family still goes with him. He has some of his family that travels with him, but he leaves his family's area to go find a place where God has made for him. Now, many people will say, well, it was Israel, but I don't think it is. I think he's still working on, I think that place that is builder and maker is God is heaven, okay? And I think that's where Abraham was looking forward to going, okay? So I don't think it was necessarily the land in which God had promised them. That's part of it, but ultimately Abraham was looking for a city whose builder and maker was God, and that was heaven, okay? So as we look at this, we see the family of Ham, all of his descendants, with their language, they're going to go into countries and into nations, and they are going to establish those with their language, and they are going to be considered the Canaanites, okay? Any questions? Any thoughts? Okay? All right. Let's go to the next one. Shem. So Shem is verses 21 through 31, and you'll see all the descendants. Unto Shem also, in verse 21, it says, unto Shem also the father of all the children of Eber, the brother of Japheth, the elder, even to him were children born. Okay? And so then it starts listing out his brothers. Now, one of the interesting things about this, now, I don't know where everyone stands on this. I'm going to kind of give you, and this is one of those things that I am not going to die. It's not one of those things I'm going to draw a line in the sand, and I'm not going to die on a hill for this, okay? Now, one of the things I do believe is there is someone that is mentioned in these verses, and as you look at this, it's very interesting, okay? You go down to verse... Sorry, it's right in the middle. Go down to verse 25. Okay? It says, unto Eber were born two sons. The name of one son was Peleg, for in his days was the earth divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. Okay? Now, I believe, and I think there's very good support for this, is during the time of Peleg, this is when you start seeing the lands and you see the earth start shifting and you see continents. Now, we know, did the continents move in just one quick snap? No, it took some time, okay? Now, I think there was still enough room, enough area for when they divided, when the Tower of Babel happened, that when the languages were blurred and languages were changed, that as the brothers would separate and take their families with them, there was enough time for them to get to where they needed to be, where God wanted them to be. And as they moved, the lands moved with them, okay? Now, you're going to probably go, well, how could that all happen? It's by God, okay? That's all how it happened. I believe that the land masses all at one point were one mass, and as after the Tower of Babel, you see them divide even further to separate them out, and you see Japheth, Ham, and Shem, you see them all in different regions, okay? And it's based off of two things: family and language, okay? The common language of that culture would take them to different areas and where they needed to go. Now, some people say that the brothers look different. I don't know. I don't think we have anything to prove that or show us that. At that point, you're speculating, okay? I lean towards that the earth started shifting and moving into the continents during the time of Peleg, okay? And so as we see that happening, we can see that the families are going to be segregated to their continents, and we're going to see that separation going on. And so one of the things I've heard some people say is the Gentiles would be the English or the European and the Americas, and then I don't know. Everyone has their speculation, and I'm not going to try to figure it out. So I don't think anyone really knows. But the other thing about the lineage of Shem is I believe it is also the godly lineage. It is the lineage that God blessed. This is the lineage that Abraham will come through, and he will build nations. It says in verse 31, it says, "These are the sons of Shem, after their families, after their tongues, in their land, and after their nations." And so as they would move and as they would shift into the different areas that they went, we will find that this is when you start seeing the earth even being populated even more, okay? Now, again, I think all of this is happening after the Tower of Babel, which is in chapter 11, okay? Okay. Does anyone have any questions or thoughts? Anything anyone wants to add? Everyone's looking at me like, sure. Okay? All right. Let's look at the last verse, verse 32. It says, "These are the families of the sons of Noah after their generations in their nations, and by these were the nations divided in the earth after the flood." Okay? So this is also a verse that I would go to and tend to lean on, that talks about how that not only were the nations divided, but the earth was divided, okay? And that through these movements, and after the Tower of Babel, and as these nations separated, the land masses would move and separate the people to where it would, not only did their languages get blurred, but they were separated by water and by continents. And there are, well, I want to be careful. Let me just say this. These guys aren't as dumb as we think they are. Okay? I think there are very smart people, and I think that they had intelligence, and they had the ability to do things that I think that some of us don't give them credit for. Okay? And I think as they had that common language, there was really nothing that could stop them. Once the languages and the families were divided, things slowed down because they had to figure out how to communicate with each other, okay? Now, what does that look like? I don't know. How did the languages change so much, and how did they know what was? I don't know. They figured it out. When you start having when your tongue is changed and you're doing, I don't know how that would work. I don't know how God would make that work, but God did. And through these people, we see even more people coming, and we see nations nations growing, cities growing, and we get to a point where we're going to see Abraham come out of the line of Shem, and through his lineage, we're going to see even more of the land and of the people growing, and I think we're going to see even more people grow, the population even grow even more as all this happens. So Okay? Any thoughts? I told you that's going to be short. That's all I got. Any questions, any thoughts?